Good evening and welcome to Freedom is a Constant Struggle with your host, Kilu Nyasha. And board opping is Sydney Madison. I'm losing it. Uh, Raj Patel is an award winning writer, activist, and academic, and I'm delighted to have him as our guest here today on Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And he's a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and a senior research associate at Uhuru Unit for the Humanities at the university currently known as Rhodes University, South Africa. He has degrees from the University of Oxford, the London School of Economics, and Cornell University, has worked for the World Bank and World Trade Organization and protested against them around the world. He has been a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley's Center for African Studies, an honorary research fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu Natal, and continues to be a fellow at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First. Co-taught, Raj co-taught the 2014 Edible Education class at UC Berkeley with Michael Pollan. He was also an IATP Food and Community Fellow from 2011 to 2013, and he has testified about the causes of the global food crisis to the House Financial Services Committee and was an advisor to Oliver De Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Patel has written extensively for numerous newspapers and periodicals and several books, including Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and The Value of Nothing, How to Reshape Market Society and Redefine Democracy. In a New York Times bestseller, he is currently working on a groundbreaking documentary project about the global food system with award-winning director Steve James. We got off to a little bit of a rocky start, but it's so good to see you and so
Lovely to
good to
see you
have
too,
you
Keely.
back on Freedom.
It's. I mean, and freedom is a constant struggle.
Yes, it is.
And that's sort of what I was hoping we'd get to talk about a little bit today, Kilo,
Right.
is the struggles that are around the world that I'm connected to or really inspired by are struggles like Black Lives Matter, struggles like the struggles of shack dwellers in South Africa, struggles around food and control of the food system,
Right.
struggles around climate change, and struggles around debt and the fight for 15. These are all struggles that are, I mean, in a sense, of course, that they come out of this a series of long histories around people protecting their environment, protecting their homes, protecting their community, protecting the way that they exchange. But one of the things that really strikes me, and one of the things I want to just get into with you, Kilo, is how uh, these are all kind of people are pushing back against a system.
Right.
And for me, the way that you understand that system is, I mean, let's start thinking about McDonald's like $1 burger, right? A burger shouldn't cost $1. If you include all the environmental costs associated with $1 burger, as some researchers have done, it should be $200. But who
Right.
can afford a $200 burger? You can't afford a $200 burger because your wages are too low. So you need cheap food to keep cheap workers going. But
Right.
it's not
Now,
just cheap workers.
let me
It's
interrupt you for just a second. Would you
Yeah.
explain to our viewers exactly why a hamburger winds up being valued, really? The value of the hamburger is actually $200 because of the what goes into it, into the production of the beef, the production, the labor costs, the whole 9 yards. Would you
Right.
explain that?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at who's getting paid the least in the US right now, it's if you're in some kind of formal employment, it's going to be people working in the food system. Seven or eight of the worst paid jobs in America are around food. It's either food service or food processing or harvesting, meat packing, the whole thing. It's all incredibly badly paid. So workers are being exploited. But on top of that, the environment is being destroyed. So in order to have cheap beef, you need these concentrated animal feeding operations where there are lagoons. The technical term is a lagoon of waste. It's basically a lagoon of crap that is dangerous, that pollutes the air and the groundwater. And so you have environmental costs that are externalized from the price. So the price of a dollar doesn't really pay workers well. It fleeces the environment. It kicks over to other parts of the world the dangers associated with climate change. And of course, this dollar burger isn't necessarily very good for you. So it kicks into the future the healthcare costs associated with you eating badly. All of the costs associated with the environment, health, society are all in that dollar burger. So are all externalized from that dollar burger, and all, McDonald's is making profit even off that dollar because they're getting other people to pay for the subsidies, to pay for the Small Business Administration loans to set up your local McDonald's as a small business. The whole system is kind of set up to be able to provide this cheap dollar burger while it's exploiting workers in the environment. So is that kind of clear? That I mean,
Yes,
if you were
but
to include the environmental cost,
yes, but while we're talking about environment and beef, it's also a fact that um, the the cattle industry is really impacting the environment badly and the food supply badly because they're feeding these cows grain. They're not grazing. They're eating grain and so on. And also, I heard recently that the water that they have to consume is huge
right? I mean, that's it.
at
So
a time when there's droughts every.
that's it. So the way that capitalism distributes food is on the basis of ability to pay. So if you can pay for a dollar burger, then you get to divert grain from the bowls of people who can only afford to eat grain, right? You're able to shunt this grain through the power of your purchasing into a cow that then gets turned into this dollar burger. And it's about 7 pounds of grain is required for 1 pound of beef. But the amount of water is many, many, many times that.
Right.
And again, in a time of drought, your this single dollar burger embodies cubic meters upon cubic meters of water, and all of that is just in this dollar burger, just for this one crappy thing.
Right.
So you're absolutely right, Kilo. And then there are things that we don't talk about, like in order to have the grain that goes into your cow or your pig or whatever it is, you have to, in some cases, deforest in the Amazon, where
Right.
Brazil
Yes.
is one of
Yes.
the big places where soy is grown, and soy is the kind of big feed, particularly for chickens and for swine, but also to some extent for cows. You have to deforest the Amazon. You're chopping down the Amazon. You're clipping away at the lungs of the world.
Right.
And again, these are costs that are never appearing in your dollar burger, but they're costs that real people have to live with every day.
Right. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about how um, the the fact that there is a global food crisis, and that if we're not going to really be able to feed 9 billion people, by the time 2050 rolls around, is what
Right.
I've been hearing. We're
Well.
going
I
to run
mean,
out of food.
we could feed 9 billion people in 2050 if we ate radically differently to the way we're eating now. But we don't have enough planet to be able to eat like America does. There isn't enough world. We eat so much meat here. We eat so badly. We waste so much food. We're so profligate that
Exactly.
there's just no way it can happen. We don't, the amount of carbon we use in making the meat, the planetary resources we use when we waste and when we dump, and where these lagoons of crap drain into. We don't have enough planet for everyone to be doing that.
Right.
And so, I mean, back in the day, I don't know if Kilu, you and I are old enough to remember that when
I'm plenty old enough.
well, so you remember that there was this sort of white American anxiety about what will happen if all the Chinese get fridges. You remember that, where it was like, oh my god, if everyone in China has a fridge, this planet is cooked. We're all doomed. And in the end, there were ways around that problem, and the CFCs, the ozone destroying chemicals, were phased out, and it was it ended up being kind of okay for everyone in China to be able to have just a basic kind of refrigeration, or to have higher levels of access to refrigeration than we have
Right.
now. But there's no way. The problem isn't China. The problem is America. What if everyone in China eats like everyone in America does? I mean, already China has the highest rates of diabetes on Earth. And I mean, that to some extent, that's not surprising because China has the most people. But there's no way that this is good for China to start eating more and more like America. And it's no good
It's
for the
not good
planet.
for anyone to start eating like Americans.
There you go. I mean, America's the country where people, kids born today are predicted to die younger than their parents
They
because of
just
the way.
they just discovered a child of 3 years old with type 2 diabetes.
It's
That's
so,
ridiculous.
but that's it. You see, the way that we eat in this country doesn't reflect the cost. So the interesting question is, why do we need cheap food? And we need cheap food because wages are low. And what are the other things you need when wages are low? You need cheap care. So you need the work of bringing up children to be cheap. And in fact, that 3-year-old kid with type 2 diabetes, I bet wasn't eating, expensive, kale and sirloin steak and all the rest of it. It's going to be cheap food, presumably because that's what the marketers have been pushing on this family. There weren't any alternatives available, and in constrained times, people can make very bad choices because good choices aren't available. So
Exactly.
I don't want to hold up this 3-year-old kid and say the parents of this kid must be monsters, because that's no parent wants their kid to have diabetes, and
No, but also it's a question of education.
it is
Our
but it's
our
also a
people are
question of
not
access.
educated about food.
Mhm.
Is any does any of do any of us get taught what and how to eat?
We do. We get taught
Even
every day by
doctors
McDonald's,
do
by
not
Coke.
have nutrition in their medical courses.
Well,
I'm
that's you see, Keela. One of the fantastic things about being here in Austin is I get to be a professor of nutrition as well.
Oh wow,
And
yeah, good.
the joy of that is that I'm trying to take on the education that we're getting from other places. So in England, for example, more kids trust Ronald McDonald to dispense nutritional advice than trust a doctor or a teacher.
Oh
I mean,
goodness.
obviously these are kids; they're idiots. But kids are these strategic marketing opportunities to pester their parents into making parents eat bad choices. The marketers know this very, very well, and I think what's interesting is, look, every parent, every one of us is being taught about how to eat, and we're being taught badly by
Exactly.
corporations that
Yeah,
have
I
provided these.
understand that in Europe, at least in some countries, it's illegal to advertise direct to children.
Yeah, but the corporations find ways around it,
They still
and
do.
the place that I'm super excited about that's taking on a really important approach to this is Brazil. Now, Brazil, there's a kind of governmental unit whose job it is to protect kids' human rights, and they said, you know what? One of the things about being a kid is that you're not terribly rational. I mean, kids
Really?
we have noticed in our own lives that kids can be kind of dumb sometimes. That's why we don't let them vote
They're
or
very
carry guns.
inexperienced.
Yes, exactly. But then if we don't let them vote or carry guns, why is it that we're marketing to them anything? Because the idea of marketing in economics is you're trying to persuade a rational consumer about the merits of your product. That's what
Right.
marketing is meant to be. But if you don't have a rational consumer, what are you doing marketing to this person? I mean,
Right.
then and so what the Brazilians are saying is we should stop all marketing of everything to children. Everything.
I think so.
I'm with
I
that as
really
well,
do.
and I think that opens a space for us to be free.
Right.
But that's what we have to struggle against, right? We can. It's fine to know, well, you probably should eat something that's green, and you probably should do this, that, and the other. But if you can't afford it, and even if you know that you have to avoid the sugary stuff, if you have very little time to be able to parent properly, you have very little access, and you want your kid to be happy, you may end up making some poor choices. But that's a place where there are very few good choices to make, and I kind of feel angry about not the parent, but more the context in which those choices aren't available.
Right, because there are real food deserts in America in poor communities where all
Well,
you have is a local liquor store and you don't have any fresh produce anywhere near
well, so
people's homes.
well, so Keto, when was the first time you heard the term food desert?
Oh my goodness.
Well, I'm asking because it's really
Several
interesting.
years ago, it's at least several years.
Yeah, but it's interesting that we weren't born with it, right? It's not an idea
No, it's
that's
not,
been
I
around for
never heard
ages.
it when
It's
I was young,
no,
because
exactly.
when I was young, people had gardens, and people grew a lot of their own collard greens, and a lot of people, had their own chickens, and
Right.
even in urban communities, there was a lot of produce and fresh food. Guys used to go fishing and come home with lots of fish and spread it around the neighborhood, and that kind of thing. But that those days are gone.
And it's really interesting that then guess who decides what a food desert is? Well, these days it's a USDA definition, and it was kind of written by Walmart. I mean, it's the definition of a food desert now is that there's poor folk who don't have access to a supermarket. That's the USDA definition of so it's poverty on top of no supermarket. And that definition's kind of weird because
No,
you
because
know,
if they were near a farmer's market, that
eh,
would be even better than a supermarket.
right, but you don't, as far as the USDA is concerned, there's none of that. And the other thing, of course, is if they weren't poor, we wouldn't be talking about a food desert either.
Right.
And again, that's why these movements around food, around wages are really important, but also around care. Because I want to get back to this kid. The, the mother of this child presumably is working and working really hard, and she's not getting paid to take care of her kid. There's reproductive labor is never paid for under capitalism, right?
I
And
know. I'm
and
a single mom.
no, there you go, right? So,
Hmm.
but that is a really targeted, very gendered exploitation. There's patriarchy at work under capitalism. And so capitalism needs cheap food, but it needs cheap workers, and it needs cheap care, and it needs cheap nature in order to be able to, outsource all the costs of your dollar burger. It needs cheap fuel, so you can go to the drive-through, and so these ingredients can be stitched around the world. And in order for that to happen, you need labor that's worthless, but you need to be able to think of that labor as worthless. So you need cheap lives. Uh, and that's all stitched up with the idea also of cheap money, of
Tell me
corporations and
about it.
countries in particular being able to borrow away and make us suffer the consequences of their debt. And so, I mean, I think that there are these sort of seven cheap things that stitch the world together. It's cheap food, labor, care, nature, money, lives, and together these seven cheap things are a way of understanding how movements for Black lives, for example, the movement for Black lives is connected to movements about climate change, connected to movements to fight for 15, and movements to pay for housework, and a range of other movements around debt and a range of other things. And I think they're all connected. What do you think of that? You
Well,
buy it?
mainly the Black Lives Matter right now is dealing with the horrific um, police brutality and murder that's become so prevalent and so frequent. There's hardly a day goes by that you don't hear about a young black person being murdered or jailed or beaten unmercifully. And uh, we hear about settlements, but we don't hear about and then payouts. And of course, that means that the taxpayers are basically paying for the police brutalities. Uh, you know, um, the policemen who have done this brutality, the taxpayers are picking up the tab for their bad behavior,
Right.
and they are being exonerated. They're not even being charged. So many of them.
Yeah.
Every now and then, if we raise enough hell, then someone gets charged. But for the most part, most of them are getting away scot free.
Yeah.
So that's a serious, serious problem that's going on now. And Black Lives Matter. People need to understand that yes, all lives matter, but Black lives are the ones that are targeted most frequently. In
Right.
fact, about
Uh,
every 28 hours, a Black life succumbs to a vigilante or a police officer.
and there are there's around the world there are groups that are so inspired by Black Lives Matter, and find and recognize themselves in Black Lives Matter. I mean, let's look to South Africa, for example,
Right.
where levels of xenophobia are incredibly high, where Nigerians, for example, and Somalis to some extent are targeted as darker than uh, South Africans, and their race is measured in certain
Oh
kinds of
my
ways.
goodness, the color
Um,
struck BS is going on there too.
there's that, and then there are other ways in which the police are allowed to kill, and they're allowed to kill poor people in particular.
Well,
So when
they
you think
killed
about
what 34 miners at Maracana. What was that?
Americana, that's right, yeah. Um, Certainly the police were given the green light to kill uh, labor organizers.
Yeah,
That's a global problem, right?
right. And Sabu Abu
Yes,
Zakodi
Spuzikode in
has
Abashali Basin Jondolo, the Shack
right.
Dwellers movement in South Africa, he has been a marked man ever since they fired him from his job as being a gas station attendant in South Africa.
Is he
Um,
safe now?
he is. He doesn't. I mean, he's been driven out of the shack dweller community where his house was burned down, and
Oh,
he's got so many death threats, and his children, his wife, live. I mean, Amnesty International put them up for a little while, and then they managed to find a place. But it's a precarious life for them.
I'm
Um,
sure, because I remember him telling me about a young woman who was murdered for her activism that was part of the Abahlali movement.
and sadly, there are still more people who are shack dweller organizers, who are organizers for the poorest people in South African society who live in precarious conditions in shack settlements. And they are being targeted by the police and by the government. And
Right.
uh,
Let's talk a little bit about how um, the the decolonization of numerous countries in Africa
mm,
has not led to freedom. It's led to more enslavement. Only this time it's economic slavery.
well, I think the way that slavery has been instrumented, the way that has happened, is where the British flag or the French flag or whatever it was flag comes down, and then up comes this way better flag, and there's a new national anthem, and you're still keeping the basic tenets of the state there and the state
Exactly.
apparatus.
Exactly.
More than that, you're demobilizing the struggle.
Exactly.
If freedom is a constant struggle, you're de-struggling, and therefore you're de-freeing.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
and that's one of the nice.
It's a protracted struggle, and
Right, exactly.
and
I mean,
once you take power, then a new revolution begins.
well, this is what Frantz Fanon was talking about when he's talking about the sort of the pitfalls of the national bourgeoisie. He's
Exactly.
saying, look, these are the guys who, they'll be waving the flag because they drew the flag, and they quite like the idea of being in charge. And as soon as they, kick out the rulers, they will become the rulers, and they will demobilize, and they will use the flag to gag you and strangle you. And that actually has happened almost to a T in South Africa. But this is the thing about things
What
like
is
the
that?
shack
Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, but that's the thing about South Africa as a site of struggle. That people think, oh, South Africa, Nelson Mandela, he was awesome. He had great shirts. At the end, when South Africa became free, it was like the end of the Lion King. Everyone was singing the Circle of Life, la 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 la. But that's not how it worked. The national bourgeoisie took power, and of course they assumed debt. The World Bank went out of its way to make sure that the new South Africa would have debts that it could only repay through the kinds of exports that it had always been doing, through exports of minerals, in particular. I mean, South Africa's gold and diamonds. But it's set up. Debt was part of the change, but also the idea of national struggle. When the ANC said, "We have won, comrades, we have won, and everything is going to be fine," they actively tried to demobilize. And what I love about Abahlali Basim Jondolo as well, I mean, there are a number of movements in South Africa, is they don't feel they've crossed the threshold of the end of apartheid yet. And so they still keep on fighting, and they're still organized. And that's the thing that I think we ought to be learning from here.
Exactly.
Is, when God forbid, there are folk who say, well, if only we just give it to Bernie Sanders, everything's going to be great. The trouble is that unless you have movements for organizing at a grassroots level that are way more militant than any elected representative, then you've given power up, right?
Exactly.
Without the cells, without the feeling of power that comes from organizing, there's nothing. Then you've just delegated politics to some other guy.
Right. We have to
And
have a revolutionary party. We have to
right,
have our own revolutionary movement, a political party on which the people can ride to power.
where do you see that, Kilo, in the United States?
Uh, Unfortunately, I don't see it happening at this point in time because people still think that they can work within this system as a third party. And for example, the Green Party, they have a lot of good things in their platform.
Mm.
But on the other hand, they're plugged into the system, which means they can't get on the stage, they can't get in the debates, they can't get media attention. And they're not organizing, doing the grassroots organizing that I think takes many, many years
Yeah.
to build a political party that is revolutionary
Do you think the movement for Black
and
Lives has a...
international, because we have to have an international movement. The
Mm.
United States is international. We're a microcosm of the world, and its poor people have to come together,
Mm.
just as the prisoners are finally coming together
Yes.
and ending their hostilities, thanks to people like Hugo Pinel and many other brothers who have fought and sacrificed their lives and been martyred,
Mm.
to bring about ethnic, racial unity.
Mm.
It's really ethnic national unity because there's one human race. So until we get to the point where we can really begin to choose our politicians, our friends, our mentors, not on the basis of their skin color or their ethnicity, but on the basis of their heart, their politics, their spirit of revolution,
Mm.
but essentially their politics. Do they love the people? Like Che Guevara said, a true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. I have often questioned people who call themselves revolutionaries or movement, you know, people in the movement,
Mm.
and they don't love people. You can see it in their practice.
Right.
Well, what are you in it for? Your own aggrandizement?
Right.
Opportunism? To shine?
But so Kilo, do you see, like, in the movement for Black Lives a moment where there could be this more radical transformation, or what
I
do you
think
think?
it's already more radical than a lot of other movements.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, they've embraced the LGBT community big
Right.
time. They've embraced other ethnic groups. There's an Asians for Black Lives
Yes, there is
group right
another.
here in the city.
Yeah.
And I understand there's some Chicanos for Black Lives Matter,
Mm-hmm.
and they are already reaching out, and more young people are just throwing off this xenophobic crap. We don't need it. We can't use it. We really need to come together, and we of course all of us are a little more comfortable with our own culture.
Right.
That's normal. That's natural. But I don't think it's time to be comfortable.
But so, is there a way of making the movement for Black Lives talk to things? I mean, around issues like labor, like the fact that, like debt, like the way that we, that communities of poor people are fighting for things, not just freedom from police brutality, which is a sad and everyday occurrence,
Right.
but for other things that are also sad and everyday occurrences that are, have their own mortalities
Well,
associated with
I understand they already have a platform that is kind of patterned after the old Black Panther Party 10-point platform. So I think that they do. I think that we have to give them time, and I think we have to, as elders, we have to encourage them. Hopefully have some input, but also listen to them and hear their creative ideas for struggle, because
I think
it's
that's
the
absolutely
youth,
right.
the bold, audacious youth who make the revolution. Really,
I think you're
who
right.
spearhead it.
And that's what's so lovely about that movement. In the same way that Occupy was important as well, I think that it was a moment of young people realizing that they didn't have to take this shit. They didn't have to believe.
Ooh, watch your language. We can't do
Oh,
that.
well, excuse me. They didn't have to take this at
No.
all. And in part, I mean, I think that there was, there's a really interesting moment then that comes with a sort of recognition that debt isn't the only thing that you have to live for. I mean, I'm here particularly with, I mean, a whole bunch of young people who are mostly in debt.
Oh my goodness, people are graduating with $40,000, $100,000 hanging over their heads. It's horrible what they're doing to young people today. When I was coming along, I could have gone straight to City College for nothing, for
Mm,
free. You know, uh, I matriculated in Hunter for evening school in New York for a minute, and I don't even remember what it cost because it was so cheap. It was just fees, and I was working, and I wasn't making a ton of money, but I don't even remember what it cost. It was
mm,
so cheap. So it's crazy what they're doing to young people today.
yeah,
They're denying them a future, and they're redirecting them to mass incarceration,
right.
pure and
Yeah.
simple.
But and I think that there's this sort of moment that's ready to happen when thinking about the movement Black Lives, thinking about labor, thinking about care, and really thinking about this world of care work, of caring for young, for the young and for the old,
Oh, I
caring for
know. I'm
building
having
communities.
problems galore with trying to keep care, to help. And I'm not alone for sure.
Oh,
There's hundreds of thousands of people, elders who are having a hard time with a setup that doesn't really work well. In-home support services is just unbelievable. I mean, it takes somebody. I hire a new worker. It takes them 2 months to get their first paycheck, about
so,
6 weeks or more to get their first timesheet, and then another 2 weeks to finally get their paycheck. And they're working for cheap, and
right.
so I have to subsidize as much as my little pocket can stand, and it's crazy. It's really crazy what they do.
And yet, of course, that's the system at work, right? Where of course, therefore, if people were being charged $200 for a hamburger, they would starve. And so you need the cheap food in order to be able to have the cheap care, in order to be able to have the workers who scrabble paycheck to paycheck. You need the cheap gas so that people can go from one place to another,
Well, one of the
without.
things, if I may inject, one of the things I've learned how to do is I know how to be poor.
Mm,
And you can be poor and healthy.
yeah, no,
You
for
really
sure.
can.
Yeah,
Okay, but you have to have, like your book, I want to bring that up, the, um, the
it's
value of
bad
nothing.
nothing. Yeah,
And it came from Oscar Wilde's We Know the Price of Everything and the Value of Nothing.
right.
Okay, so uh, so many people are brainwashed with commercials that they see nonstop everywhere, from television to radio to billboards, etc.
Right.
So they're constantly tempted and to buy this, buy that, buy the other thing, be a fashion show and
Yeah.
all that. But the bottom line is you really can have a few basic things uh, and some very basic uh, household goods, furniture or whatever, very simple, uh, inexpensive things, and I always put food first.
Mm,
I see people spending a lot of money on everything but food, and they'll complain. Well, if you go to farmer market, it's expensive, and so they don't want to spend an extra dollar for some fresh fruit or avocados or beets or something that's really nutritious, but they'll go and spend $2 on a soda pop or something, something that's terrible for them, or a beer
right.
or whatever. I don't even know what a beer costs anymore. I mean, I never drank it, so I don't know what it costs. What does it cost?
Um, well, the kind of beer I drink is is made artisanally and in a cooperative, and so it's like I don't know what a 6 pack is $8 or $9, but that's beer where you're paying for it.
Ah,
But you can get cheap ass beer for $2-3 for a 6 pack, right?
oh, okay. But in any case, one of the things I brought along, Raj, if you don't mind my uh, going off a little bit, was I did a little research and came up with facts about hunger.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to cite them and then I know you can take off on them, okay?
Sure.
Okay, so One, nearly 842 million people are suffering from hunger. 98% of people suffering from hunger live in developing countries. Hunger kills more people every year than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. Hunger causes the deaths of about 5 million children each year. About 17 million children are born underweight annually, the result of inadequate nutrition before and during pregnancy. Our beef comes from Iowa, fed by Nebraska corn. Our grapes come from Chile, our bananas from Honduras, our olive oil from Sicily, our apple juice not from Washington State, but all the way from China. Modern society has relieved us of the burden of growing, harvesting, and even preparing our daily bread in exchange for the burden of simply paying for it. Only when prices rise do we take notice, and the consequences of our inattention are profound. Last year, the rocketing cost of food was a wake up call for the planet. Between 2005 and the summer of 2008, the price of wheat and corn tripled, and the price of rice climbed fivefold, spurring food riots in nearly 24 countries and pushing 75 million more people into poverty. But unlike previous shocks driven by short term food shortages, this price spike came in a year when the world's farmers reaped a record grain crop. This time, the high prices were a symptom of a larger problem tugging at the strands of our worldwide food web, one that's not going away anytime soon. Simply put, for most of the past decade, the world has been consuming more food than it has been producing. After years of drawing down stockpiles in 2007, the world saw global carryover stocks fall to 61 days of global consumption, the lowest on record. So, what is hot, crowded, and what is a hot, crowded, and hungry world to do?
Well, so there's so much there that's fascinating, Kilo. You're so right. I mean, it's true that the global food crisis came and went. Actually, people are like, no, there isn't a food crisis anymore. Everything's fine. But of course, there's still 850 odd million people who, by a new definition, a more forgiving definition, are food insecure. So some people say, well, actually, the real figure is nearer a billion, not 850 odd million. So there's still, in order to meet some of their targets, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, some people have noticed, have messed around with the figures, so that it seems like everything is much better now than it was in the past. And it's really interesting
Well, how
to see
could it be better when you have how many millions of refugees now
Right.
that are hungry? They have nothing.
Right. No, that's it. I mean, it's
Drowning at sea, being brutalized at borders.
No, and I think that this is part of the story that, at the same time as we have these massive conflicts caused by, the sort of brutal wars that started by this country.
Right.
And building on a colonial legacy that for which Europe has everything to answer for. But now governments have said, look, we don't need so many stocks because the market will provide, and so we can draw those. We can make grain available cheaply for those dollar burgers so that the workers will be happy. But I think one of the interesting things is historically. I mean, for as long as there have been cities, there have been food riots.
Right.
There have been, well, not riots really. Rebellions is the right word. People call them riots,
Right.
but that's because you're not listening. If you listen, it's not a riot. It's always a rebellion, because people are not just going in the streets losing their minds.
Right.
They are going into the streets with really articulate demands about who it is that has to give up what in order to be able for people to be happy again. And they want cheap food. I mean, they want food available, but they also want a range of other things like employment and dignity and freedom from violence. And that's, these food rebellions are historically, I mean, they've existed since the Romans. So
Right.
the leaders have always wanted a way of keeping workers quiet in cities, and cheap food has been part of that trick. And in order to do that, you needed always to exploit peasants. You always needed to exploit people in rural areas so that the people in urban areas could have cheap food. And if you ran out of things to exploit in rural areas, you would always go overseas and you would exploit and you would colonize. And so there's this long history, particularly under capitalism since 1450, of European capitalism and now world capitalism, exploiting peasants in order to keep workers, kind of fed, and the people who are going hungry. Let's talk about them. Who are they? They are most likely to be agricultural workers. The very people who are growing the food in rural areas are also the ones who are very likely to be malnourished. I mean, not overwhelmingly, but very likely. And
Yeah, they
it's
they
true.
don't earn enough to feed their families.
Right. Well, that's it. And they've been brought into this wage system where there's now no place for them to grow their food. And when they're kicked off the land, sometimes they'll go to the cities, where in some ways it'll be even worse, because at least in the rural areas they could manage to find something to eat. But when you go to a city, what are you going to forage? Like you say, I mean,
Yeah,
if you remember a time before food deserts, cities might have had some space to be able to grow food, but you have to be very lucky to live in a city where anything can be gleaned or taken or grown. And if you're living in a shack dweller community, if you're living in what some people call slums, then you are hard out of luck. I mean, you're going to struggle,
it's
and
what we
you don't
call
even have the land to fall
it's
back
what we
on.
call SOL.
Yeah, there we are. But I'm
Yeah,
minding my language with the FCC
right.
looking over my shoulder. But I know exactly what that means. So,
But
there is this history of, look,
yeah,
there's a connection between workers and peasants, and it's
right.
about capitalism exploiting them, and connection around hunger, and a connection around care, but also a connection around hope. And I'm kind of excited to see where the movement for Black Lives kind of links these things together, just as other movements in other parts of the world have.
Right. And I wanted to ask you about the interest rates because you also worked for a bank,
Hmm.
and I think you're up on this kind of stuff that I'm not. um, the interest rates have been hovering around almost nothing, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Zero for what, since 2008?
Yeah. There.
Okay. Now that said, the stock market went nuts just recently and dropped like 600 points or something out of fear that the Fed were going to raise interest rates.
Yeah.
What happens if they do raise interest rates? Well, they're going to. So,
Mhm.
what happens when they do raise interest rates, which is almost inevitable?
Well, so the response to the economic crisis has been because governments have given up a lot of the kind of techniques that they used once to use to be able to manage an economic crisis. I mean, back in the day, under a Keynesian model, the government would start spending, and it would embark on public works projects, for example. It would just generally start printing money and then spend it.
Right.
Um, and
Kind
in
of like
spending,
what Roosevelt did during the
eh,
New Deal.
right,
Okay.
and that would be inflationary. That would reduce the cost of money, but people would be okay with that because it would generate jobs. But the idea of government going out and doing large scale works now is unthinkable. Everyone wants small government. No one wants the government messing in your stuff. The only things that we seem prepared to let our government do is arm. And so the military, of course, has their $1 trillion plus budget,
No, I
and then of
know.
course commitments like Social Security and what have you are an important part of the government budget, and the Republicans are doing everything they can to make that go away. But given that we're not allowed, the government isn't allowed to aggressively create these public works projects, the only lever it has to be able to to be able to generate economic growth is to reduce the cost of borrowing, so that if you are a Republican job creator, you can get money for pretty much nothing, so that then you can invest it in something and maybe you'll be able to create jobs. And so creating very, very cheap money is kind of the Fed's way of just kind of throwing money out of helicopters and really throwing it towards the rich, but making borrowing effectively zero so that you can have economic activity. The worry is that when you start raising interest rates, you slow that economic activity down. People are like, no, I don't need to invest in something that has a net. Maybe if I invest in this business, whatever it is, I'll get a 1% return. But if interest rates are 1%, then you don't have to take the risk of investing in the business. You just ask the government to give you 1% return. So that's the logic behind not raising interest rates is that you want economic activity to happen, but that's only in a world where the only lever you have over the economy is interest rates. Does that make sense, Kilu? So basically, you have your one lever of a little bit of economic activity, a lot of economic activity, a little bit, a lot. But the only thing that you can say is, hey, you entrepreneur, do the right thing. And you're talking to entrepreneurs who are the very people who got us into this mess, right? You're talking to the banks. You're talking to the sort of titans of industry. You're not talking about giving money to poor people. You're talking about giving money to investors, and that's the problem with this story. Is that actually, if we had been directly just given this money away to America's poor, we'd be in a much better position, because the spending would have happened rather than the investing or the hoarding or the speculating or whatever it is. So the worry about raising interest rates is that it will slow economic activity down. But there's nothing there's nothing the government does because it's tied its hands behind its back.
We have only about 5 minutes left, and I was wondering if you could address these horrendous inequities that exist. It's not even 1%; it's a fraction of 1%.
Right, exactly.
That own and control the wealth, and the 99.9 or something percent of the rest of us are just in trouble for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, Kikilu, we were just talking before we came on air. I was just in India, where, in Bombay, for instance, there are some of the largest informal settlements, shack settlement slums in the world, and also one of the world's largest houses. There's like an apartment block that's $650 million for a family of four. India has.
I've noted some of the
it's
ostentatious, ridiculous wealth of some Indians in the face of that massive poverty. It's just sickening.
And I think one of my favorite writers is Arundhati Roy.
Yes, I really like her. She's brilliant and beautiful.
Yeah, no, she's. I mean, she wrote so wonderfully about what these billionaires were trying to do, and what the India's rich are trying to do, which is a certain kind of secession, right? They can't actually create their own wonderful world, but what they would like to do is secede from the rest of the planet. They're quite happy to have us working for them, but they wanted to live by their own rules. And every indicator that we know about shows this really horrifying correlation between inequality and levels of depression, of crime, of environmental degradation, a range of things. Right. And you could argue, well, that this is the rich being particularly short-sighted, because even the rich are worse off in an unequal society than they would be in a more equal society.
They can't go anywhere. But they have to have such huge security,
Yeah.
They don't really have freedom.
No, and so, I mean, I think that, we do have to talk about this intersection between the value of I'm thinking about the black movement for Black Lives,
yes,
but also the idea of how you bring that kind of consciousness up against the consciousness of taking down the 1% and of making society much more equal. And at some level, it has to be confrontational. You could say, well, rich people, it's just not good for you to have so much money when, if you're interested in a more equal and better place to be for everybody, including your children.
Well, as a Panther, we had a pretty simple slogan: take it from the greedy and give it to the needy.
And I think that kind of thinking needs to become normal again. I think it's okay, and I think part of the idea of freedom,
people are already talking about a Robin Hood tax.
Mm-hmm. But I think in order to have a Robin Hood tax, you need a state that you trust, and part of the movement for Black Lives is a recognition that more and more people are distrustful of the state, and with reason.
I'm all for saying no, Raj Patel. I'm all for saying no, boycott, strike, don't buy, don't curry favor with any of these creeps. Don't buy their stuff. Don't buy what they're selling us.
but I think don't buy not. I mean, because we're never going to find the answer in a shopping basket. A lot of people are like, well, if only you buy the right thing, everything's going to be fine. But freedom isn't shopped for; it's
No, I
fought for.
understand that. I
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
that clearly. What
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
saying is that I'm thinking in terms of the BDS movement:
yeah,
boycott, divest,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
sanction Israel and
But
other.
I think
And
that's right. But I think, and what's exciting about it is, in order to thrive, you need to organize. And I think
exactly.
that's
Oh,
let's
the
get back to that, right
organizing.
back to that. That we
You have
need
to
to organize,
organize people
organize,
to understand that we need to do that.
organize.
So anyway, it's just I think what have we got left, Sydney? We got 1 minute. So Raj, give us your last thoughts.
Well, I mean, the last thoughts are I want to see the Panthers' spirit alive and well, connecting black lives, social justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and the food movement. Panthers and food, that's a conversation for another time, but it's a really
Right,
exciting conversation.
absolutely. Yes,
But
I'm
thank you
right
for
on.
keeping the spirit alive.
We're on the same page on that one. So thank you so much, Raj Patel, for being my guest here on Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Thanks, Sydney Madison, for board upping, and thank you, viewers, for tuning in to Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And all power to the people, and long live the revolutionary spirit of Hugo Pinel.